Nora Bennett walked into the fortress of the most dangerous man in New York with a recorder sewn into the lining of her coat and exactly one intention: to take Damiano Vitale apart in print, one paragraph at a time, until the whole city read the truth of him over their morning coffee. She was a nobody with a press badge and a private grudge. He was the shadow the mayor did not dare to name out loud. What neither of them could have known that first gray afternoon was that she would leave his estate 6 weeks later with his ring on her hand and his enemy's ruin spread across the front page. "You came here to bury me," he would tell her much later, in the dark, his voice almost gentle. "So bury me. I'll hold still." But that was the ending. The beginning was a woman nobody thought was worth watching. Nora had spent 11 years learning that a byline was the only kind of power the world would let her keep. She wrote for the Harbor Ledger, a dying print outlet in Lower Manhattan that survived on obituaries and the occasional lawsuit, and she was the best reporter on the floor, which no one there would admit, because admitting it would have meant looking at her long enough to notice. She was a big woman in a business run by thin men who mistook thinness for hunger. She had learned to make her body apologize before her mouth ever opened, to slip sideways through crowded newsrooms, to fold herself into the smallest chair, to laugh at the joke before it could be aimed at her. What none of them knew was that under all that trained deference, there was something cold and patient and entirely unbroken. And it had been that way since the night the sheriff's cars came up her father's drive with their lights turning silent circles on the snow. Thomas Bennett had built a small import brokerage on the East River, honest to a fault, the kind of man who paid his people first and himself last. Then, one winter, everything he owned turned to smoke. Fraud charges he'd never seen coming. Accounts that showed money he'd never touched moving to places he'd never been. Contracts with his forged signature on them, so clean the handwriting expert wept. The business was seized. The house was foreclosed, and Thomas Bennett, a proud man broken in public for crimes that belonged to someone else, did not live to see his name cleared. Because his heart gave out 3 months into a trial the newspapers had already decided he'd lost. The papers ran the word "disgraced" beside his photograph. One of those papers was the Harbor Ledger. Nora had been 22, and she had read her own future in that headline: "Find out who did this, and make the world read the truth whether it wants to or not." She had been chasing that truth for 11 years, and every trail she followed, no matter where it started, curved eventually toward the same door: the Vitale family. Everyone knew it: the whispers, the sealed records, the money that had bought her father's ruin and vanished into offshore fog. All of it, the city agreed, ran back to Damiano Vitale, who had been rising through his father's empire in exactly those years, who had swallowed a dozen small East River businesses in exactly that way, who had left exactly that kind of wreckage in his wake. So when Nora finally cracked the story that would let her inside his walls, she did not feel fear. She felt the cold, clean click of a case closing. Her mother was the reason she couldn't wait any longer. Margaret Bennett's kidneys were failing, and dialysis was a slow leak in a bank account that had been running dry since Thomas died. And the specialist who could change the odds cost more than a dying newspaper paid a reporter in a year. Nora needed the story that would resurrect her career and clear her father's name in one blow. And she needed it now, because her mother did not have the luxury of someday. Gerald Thorne, the Ledger's managing editor, did not make it easier. Gerald was a man who had failed upward his whole life and resented anyone who might make the climb look hard. When Nora brought him the Vitale pitch, the expose of a generation, the piece that could put the paper back on the map, he leaned back in his chair and let his gaze crawl over her the way it always did, and he said the thing he always said, dressed up as concern. He said the Vitale story needed a reporter who could get in the room, someone with the right look, someone people opened up to. He said, and he smiled while he said it, that maybe she'd be more comfortable staying on the obituaries where the subjects couldn't complain about who came to interview them. The junior reporters at the neighboring desks found their screens suddenly fascinating. One of them laughed under his breath. Nora did not give Gerald the flinch he was fishing for. She only stood and gathered her notes and said, in a voice as flat and final as a slammed drawer, "I'll get in the room, Gerald, And when I come out with the story that saves this paper, you're going to have to say my name to accept the award. Practice it." Then she walked out into the rain, and she got in the room the only way a woman like Nora ever got anywhere: by being twice as good and half as visible, by having already forged the credentials, secured the invitation, and memorized the floor plan of a house no journalist had ever been allowed to enter. The Vitale estate sat on a bluff over the water in the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights seemed to burn colder. Nora arrived on the night of a charity auction the family threw each winter to launder its reputation in front of photographers, and she came as a society stringer for a magazine that did not know it had hired her. Credentials good enough to pass a board guard at the gate. The plan was simple: get inside. Get inside. Get access. Get Damiano Vitale on the record, or get near enough to his world to steal the truth off it. The recorder in her coat lining hummed against her ribs like a second, patient heart. She saw him before she was ready to. Damiano Vitale did not work a room the way powerful men usually did. There was no glad-handing, no performance of warmth. He stood near the tall windows at the edge of the light with a glass he never lifted to his mouth, and the party bent itself around him the way a river bends around a piling. Everything in motion except the one still thing at the center. He was younger than the legend and harder to look away from, which annoyed her. Dark suit, dark eyes, a stillness that wasn't calm so much as coiled. When a state senator approached him, the senator did the leaning. When a woman in silver silk laughed too loudly at something he hadn't said, he did not look at her. He looked instead across the whole crowded ballroom, straight at the woman by the door with the borrowed credentials and the recorder against her heart, as if he had felt the exact weight of her attention and wanted to know what it cost. Nora looked back. She was good at not being the first to look away. That, she thought, with a hatred so clean it was almost restful, is the man who murdered my father's name. Then the woman in silver silk found her, and the evening changed. Camilla Ashford was old New York money worn down to the wire, a socialite who had spent 30 years being told she was the most beautiful woman in every room and had come to need it the way a lung needs air. She wanted Damiano. The whole party understood it, understood the patient, fraying campaign she'd been running to become the next Mrs. Vitale. She swept up to Nora with a flute of champagne and the particular radar the cruel developed for anyone who might be an easy mark, and her eyes did their slow inventory up and back down, and whatever she concluded made her smile. "Oh, you poor thing," Camilla said, pitched just loud enough for the little knot of guests trailing her. "Did the caterers give you the wrong door? The service entrance is round the back, though." A delicate, wounding pause. "I imagine you found the buffet on your way in. One always does." The knot of guests tittered. Nora felt the old heat climb her neck, the ancient reflex to shrink, to make of herself a smaller and less mockable thing. She had obeyed that reflex her whole life. She did not obey it now. She looked Camilla Ashford square in the eyes and said evenly, without a flicker, "I'm a journalist, Mrs. Ashford. I go through whichever door has the best view of the people who think a service entrance is an insult." She let that sit. "You've just given me a wonderful quote. Would you like to say it again for the record? Or shall I paraphrase?" It was not a shout. It was one quiet, surgical sentence, delivered without a tremor, and it landed like a slap, precisely because Camilla had never in her life been answered by a woman she'd decided was beneath her. The powdered face went stiff, then blotched. Her mouth opened on something ugly, and the room went quiet. Not everywhere at once, but in a spreading hush, heads turning toward the door. Because a tall, dark shape had crossed the ballroom without seeming to hurry and come to a halt an arm's length from the two women, and the shape was Damiano Vitale. He had not raised his voice. He had raised nothing at all. He simply arrived, and his stillness arrived with him, and every conversation within earshot quietly died. Camilla, just her name. He let the silence do the rest. Damiano. Her recovery was quick, decades of practice behind it. "I was only welcoming your guest. You were leaving." He said it softly, which was worse than shouting would have been. Vince will see you to your car." His eyes moved, then hurried to a broad wall of a man near the wall, who pushed off it and started forward. Then Damiano brought that flat, dark gaze back to Camilla, and for one held second, Nora watched something genuinely cold move behind the calm. Not anger, nothing so warm as anger, but a slow, deliberate cataloging. A man filing a name in a drawer that never opened by accident. "You've an old habit," he told Camilla, "of deciding people don't matter and being wrong about it in expensive ways. Go home before tonight becomes another one." Camilla went. She did not take her champagne. Then Damiano Vitale turned to look at Nora Bennett properly for the first time, and Nora looked back, and the ground tilted under her, because she understood in a rush of vertigo that the man she had come to destroy had no idea who she was. He had ruined her father, salted the earth of her family, and he could not pick her face out of a crowd. "You didn't back down from her," he said. It wasn't a question. There was something in his voice like a man turning over an object he hadn't expected to find. People back down from Camilla. It's practically a civic ordinance. "I face down worse than a woman who thinks cruelty is a personality," Nora said, and held his eyes as she said it, and let him make of it whatever he liked. A journalist. He'd caught the word. Of course he had. Whose? "My own, mostly," she said. "The byline pays worse, but it's harder to buy." The corner of his mouth did something that in another man might have become a smile. "And you came to my house," he said. "To write what exactly?" "The truth," Nora said. "If I can find it under all the money." She expected the temperature to drop. She expected a nod to one of the wall-shaped men and a firm hand at her elbow, steering her out into the cold. Instead, Damiano Vitale studied her for a long, unreadable moment, and then he did the thing that unmade all her careful planning. He smiled, fully, briefly, and it was terrible and it was real. "All right," he said. "Write it." She thought she'd misheard. "You want the truth about me?" He gestured faintly at the gilded room, the fake charity, the borrowed virtue. "Nobody's ever wanted it before. They want the legend. Easier to sell papers with a monster than a man." He stepped closer and dropped his voice so it was for her alone. "You'll have access, full access. The house, the meetings you can stomach, the questions you're brave enough to ask. On one condition." His eyes held hers. "You print what you find, not what you came here already believing. What you find. Do we have a deal, miss?" "Bennett," she said before she could think better of giving him her name. Nora Bennett. Something crossed his face, a flicker, gone before she could name it, and then it was smooth again. "Nora Bennett," he repeated, as if setting it down carefully somewhere. "We have a deal." She should have run. Instead, she shook the hand of the man she'd sworn to bury, and the cold machine in her chest, the one that had been building a case against him for 11 years, began, very quietly, to run the numbers a different way. Full access. Inside the walls. Inside the meetings, the mail, the rhythm of his men, and the geography of his secrets. She had come to steal the truth off the edges of his world. He had just handed her the keys and dared her to use them. A journalist could take a man's whole empire apart with the right access. He would never think to lock the door. "Get in the room," she'd told Gerald Thorne. Now she was in the room, and the man in it with her had opened it himself. Enzo Marchetti met her at the gate the next morning. He was Damiano's right hand, a blunt, broad, courteous man who wore his loyalty like a second skin, and he'd been sent to be her shadow, her guide, and, she understood, her minder. But there was something in his weathered face she hadn't expected, something almost like approval, and by the end of that first week she learned why. Enzo had watched a great many people come into that house wanting things, and Nora Bennett was the first one in a long time who seemed unafraid of the wanting. She worked the story the way she worked, every story, patiently, invisibly, letting people forget she was listening until they said the thing they'd never say to a man with a notebook. The family absorbed her as the reporter, a curiosity, a mascot, and so they let their guards down around her the way they never would have around a rival. And Nora sat in those rooms making herself so ornamental, So easy to overlook that men discussed shipments and enemies and debts. 3 feet from a recorder they'd forgotten was a person. She learned the house. She read the mail before Enzo filed it, and she waited, night after night, for the moment Damiano Vitale would finally say in his own voice the thing that would let her hang him. The moment never came. Instead, the story fell apart in her hands. It started with the shipping manifests. Damiano, it turned out, kept his own records of the East River takeovers everyone blamed him for. A careful man's insurance, coded and cross-referenced. And Nora, who had spent 11 years learning to read the exact kind of paper that had ruined her father, sat up 3 nights with those records and felt the cold, clean certainty in her chest curdle into something else. Because the Vitale family had not seized her father's brokerage. They had tried to save it. There in Damiano's own coded hand dated the winter Thomas Bennett fell was a record of the Vitales quietly buying up Thomas's endangered contracts to keep his business breathing. Because alive, honest Thomas Bennett running clean freight on the river was worth more to Damiano than a corpse and a scandal. And there, 2 days after Thomas's arrest, was another entry, and this one was not about money. It was fury put in the cipher. Who framed the Bennett man, and who is spending my name to do it? Damiano Vitale had not ruined her father. Damiano Vitale had spent 11 years quietly trying to find out who had, because someone had destroyed a man under Vitale protection while wearing the Vitale name like a mask. And to a man like Damiano that was not a scandal to be managed. It was a wound that had never closed. Nobody's ever wanted the truth about me, he had said. They want the monster. Easier to sell. Nora sat in the dark with a recorder full of a story she could no longer write, and understood that she had spent 11 years aiming her whole life at the wrong man. The understanding did not arrive gently. It came down like a wall, and buried under the rubble was a truth she was in no way prepared for. The man she had come to expose was the only person left in the city who wanted her father's killer found as badly as she did. She should have gone to him then. She almost did. But there was one thread still hanging. The same one that had come loose in Gerald Thorne's office when she first cracked the story. The offshore money. The forged contracts. The fog into which her father's ruin had vanished. She pulled it, and it ran, through 3 layers of faked authorization and one very clever hand, straight into the heart of the Vitale family itself. The forgeries were beautiful work. Whoever had framed Thomas Bennett, and later whoever had spent a decade nudging the blame onto the Vitales, had used the family's own paper, its own contacts, its own seals. It was an inside job, and it hadn't stopped. Someone close to Damiano, someone trusted, someone with the keys, had been feeding poisoned information to a waiting outsider for years, using the family's ruin of Thomas as the founding lie of a much larger con. And that outsider, the mind behind all of it, the man who had first destroyed Thomas Bennett to swallow his river roots, and then dressed the crime in Vitale colors to set 2 families at each other's throats, had a name that Nora finally dragged out of the fog at 3 in the morning. Cesare Bruno. Head of the rival Bruno family. The man who had wanted the East River and had taken it by burning an honest broker and framing his rivals for the fire. And the inside hand. The trusted one. The one with the keys, the one who had spent years feeding the Vitale secrets to Bruno and steering the world's suspicion onto Damiano. She found that too, at the end of the money plane, as a fingerprint, no matter how many accounts it hid behind. It belonged to the man Damiano trusted most in the world. His underboss, the one who had run the internal hunt for whoever framed Thomas Bennett, which is to say the man had been put in charge of hunting for himself, Renzo Fontana. Nora had it all now, and she had no one to give it to, because to prove it she would have to confess that she'd come into this house to destroy its master, and she no longer knew what he would do with that. She was still deciding when the Brunos moved. They moved because Renzo made them. Nora would learn later that her quiet digging had not been quiet enough. That Renzo, watching the reporter the way a snake watches a shifting shadow, had seen her at the manifests one night, too many, and understood that Damiano's pet journalist was pulling the exact thread that would hang him. So he did what cornered men do. He reached out to Cesare Bruno, and together they built a trap with 2 jaws. The first jaw closed on Margaret. Nora came back from her mother's dialysis appointment to find the private clinic Damiano had quietly moved Margaret into in an uproar, an IV line tampered with a nurse found drugged in a supply closet, and a man who did not belong there slipping out a fire door. Kane, they'd call him after, when the pieces were assembled. A code name, a ghost, the sort of professional Cesare Bruno kept for exactly this kind of message. He hadn't finished. Margaret lived, saved by a suspicious orderly and a margin of minutes. But the message was aimed past Margaret and straight at Damiano. Your reporter is digging up things that will get us all buried. Call her off, or the next one lands. And it was Renzo who delivered that message, all wounded concern, counseling Damiano to send the woman and her sick mother somewhere far and unguarded for their own protection. Out of the estate, out for behind the walls, out where Kane could finish it clean. Damiano's fury was a still white terrible thing, and Nora had never seen it turned outward before. It didn't shout. It made the whole house go silent, the way pressure drops before a storm. And in that silence, Nora made her choice, because she had never been a woman who could sit behind a wall while men decided her fate. She had only, for a long time, been told that she was. She went to Damiano's study that night, and she put her recorder and her notes on his desk. The whole story. The 11 years. The recorder sewn into her coat. The plan to take him apart, and she told him all of it, because she would not lie to him with her mother's life on the table between them. She watched something break open in his face as she talked. Not the rage she'd braced for, but a raw astonishment. The look of a man who has been alone inside a truth for a decade and has just heard another living person speak it out loud. I came here to end you, Nora said, because he deserved it plain. I've hated you since I was 22, and I was wrong about the man. But I wasn't wrong about the story. She turned her notes toward him, showed him the last forged authorization, the coded mark only the two most trusted men in the family could make. The story says Cesare Bruno destroyed my father to steal the river. The story says Renzo has been selling you to Bruno for years and using my father's grave as the cornerstone. And the story says Renzo means to bury me before I can print a word of it. Damiano looked at the coded mark for a long, long time. Then he looked at her, and when he spoke his voice had gone somewhere very cold and very quiet. You found in 6 weeks, he said, what my whole family couldn't find in 11 years. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief and fury, and under both of them turned toward her, a heat she'd been refusing to name. You walked into my house to bring me down, and you're the only person alive who ever tried to clear my name instead. He came around the desk. I have been so alone in this, Nora, that I stopped believing anyone would ever stand on my side of it, and it's you. The reporter who came to hang me, the woman I told myself I only kept close to keep an eye on, when the truth is, I've thought of almost nothing else since you told Camilla you'd quote her. The second jaw of the trap closed that same night. Renzo's men moved on the estate under cover of the manufactured emergency, expecting a frightened reporter and a distracted boss. What they found was the two of them ready, because a journalist had read the future in a stack of shipping manifests and a Mafia boss had believed her. The violence, when it came, was fast and ugly and close, and Nora would carry the sound of it a long time. She saw Damiano move for the first time the way the city whispered he could. No longer still, no longer patient, a man doing terrible arithmetic with his hands. And she understood that everything the city feared about him was true, and that every ounce of that lethal weight had rearranged itself in a heartbeat to stand between her and the men who'd come to end her. But it was Nora who turned it, because Kane, the ghost, the professional, had not come for the guards or the boss. He'd come for the reporter, the one witness whose story could put it all together. And he came quiet, up a back stair, expecting a soft, frightened woman he could deal with in the dark. He did not find one. He found a journalist, and a journalist's whole trade is getting a dangerous man to say the thing he means to keep. Nora had been wearing a wire since the night she walked through the gate. It was the oldest instinct she had. When Kane cornered her on the landing, she did not scream. She kept him talking, the way she'd kept 100 liars talking, feeding him her fears so his contempt would loosen his mouth, asking the small, stupid questions that make a killer feel safe, until he told her, laughing, exactly who had paid him and exactly why. And every word of it went out live because Nora had done the one thing no one in that house thought a curvy reporter with a press badge would ever do. She'd left a channel open to the newsroom, and to Enzo's phone, and to the world. The confession broadcast itself. Enzo's men reached the landing before Kane understood that the frightened woman had been interviewing him. Damiano found her there, lit by the red emergency glow, her recorder still running, unbroken. And the thing that had been rising between them the whole cold season finally broke its banks. He crossed the ruined landing and took her face in his bloodied hands, and kissed her the way a man kisses the surface after too long underwater. Everything at once, without apology. Possession and gratitude and a decade of loneliness ending in a single breath. And Nora, who had come to end him, who had catalogued his sins for 11 years, who had spent her whole life making her body ask forgiveness for existing, kissed him back and stopped at last, pretending she'd never wanted to. "You were never my subject," Damiano said against her mouth. "You were the only true thing that ever walked into this house. I just didn't have a word for it until now." "And what am I?" she asked. "Mine," he said, "if you'll have it. And God help the man who forgets it." But wanting each other was not the reckoning. The reckoning came for Renzo Fontana and Cesare Bruno, and Nora, a journalist to the marrow, insisted on delivering it herself in the one currency such men truly feared. Not a bullet, not a warehouse floor. The truth, printed and broadcast and impossible to bury in front of the whole watching world. They took Renzo first, because a traitor unmasked before his paymaster's a weapon you can aim. They took him at the family table, in front of Salvatore Conti and Enzo Marchetti and Vince Ricci and the whole assembled weight of the house he'd sold. Renzo came smiling, loyal Renzo, right-hand Renzo, ready to advise Damiano on the tragic necessity of disappearing the troublesome reporter. And Nora rose from her seat in her oxblood-red dress, and she set her recorder on the table, and she played Kane's confession into the silence. The paid killer naming Renzo Fontana, plain and laughing in his own voice. Then she read out the rest of it. The 11-year trail, the forged contracts that had killed her father, the coded mark only Renzo could make, the money that ran from Thomas Bennett's grave straight into Cesare Bruno's hand and back into Renzo's pocket. She did not raise her voice once. She was a reporter reading a story she had spent her whole life earning the right to read. And there is no colder sound in the world than the truth spoken plainly by a woman who cannot be argued with. Renzo's smile came apart by inches. He tried denial, then fury, then the last refuge of such men, that he'd done it all for the family's own good. Salvatore Conti, ancient and dry as a pressed flower, heard none of it. He only looked at Renzo with the exhausted sorrow of a man who has lived long enough to see every shape betrayal can take. And he said, "You put our name on an innocent man's grave and sold what was left to our enemies. There is no chair at this table for what you are." And the table agreed, in the way that table agreed to things. And Renzo Fontana discovered that the mercy he'd spent 11 years denying to others had, at the last, run dry for him. But Nora made him look at her first. She made the man who thought her too soft and too invisible to matter meet her eyes across that table, and she said, "My father's name was Thomas Bennett. He was honest, and you drowned him in your lie, and you slept fine for 11 years because you never once believed the fat girl with the notebook would be the one to dig him up. She let that land, say his name. Then understand that the person who took everything from you is the one you never bothered to see." And Renzo, at the end, said Thomas's name. It was the last useful thing he ever did. Cesare Bruno was harder, because Cesare had lawyers and a public face, and had been careful, all these years, to keep his own hands a burrow away from the blood. But Nora had spent her career finding the murder hiding inside the paperwork, and Cesare's careful distance was, to a journalist, only another gap to close. The forged contracts Renzo had made carried Cesare's money on their backs. The offshore shells, the accounts, the fortune Cesare had spent to buy an honest man's ruin and a rival family's disgrace. It had all been there since the winter her father fell. She had simply, at long last, followed it home. They did not need to put Cesare Bruno in the ground, and Nora would not have allowed it if they'd wanted to. She'd had a lifetime of the city solving things with holes in warehouse floors, and she meant to solve this one in daylight. So she did the thing a man like Cesare feared past death itself. The thing he had no defense against, because it came not from an enemy family, but from an evidence file no lawyer alive could bury. She wrote the story, all of it, the whole clean, incontrovertible arithmetic of it. And with Damiano's reach opening every door that mattered, she put it on the front page of every paper that had once printed the word disgraced beside her father's face, including the Harbor Ledger, where Gerald Dorn had to run her byline in the largest type the paper owned and choke out her name to accept the award that followed. Eleanor Prescott, the corrupt prosecutor who'd taken Bruno money to bury the truth about Thomas Bennett 11 years before, went down in the same story, her career and her freedom ending in the same paragraph. Cesare Bruno was arrested at his own gala in front of his own hired photographers, the word philanthropist still wet in the caption when the cuffs closed. He lost the money, the family, the roots, the name, everything he'd burned an honest man to steal. And the last thing he saw as a free man was a curvy journalist in oxblood red standing at the edge of the room with a recorder in her hand, watching him fall, entirely unafraid. "You should have looked harder," Nora told him quietly as they walked him past. "At the reporter you decided didn't matter. At the girl whose father you buried. You people never watch the ones who see everything." She let that land the way Camilla's cruelty had once landed on her, and then she turned her back on Cesare Bruno and did not give him the courtesy of watching him go, because he was not worth the turn of her head. He asked her once, in the study, on a quiet night after the papers had done their work, and Thomas Bennett's name had been printed clean across the whole city at last. He did not kneel because that was not the man he was. He simply took her hand and put the ring in her palm rather than on her finger, because he'd learned that Nora Bennett decided things for herself. "You came here to destroy me," Damiano said. "You did the opposite. You gave me back a name I thought I'd carry alone into the ground." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "I've spent my life among people who wanted what I could give them. You're the only one who ever came to take something from me and left me more than I started with. Marry me, Nora. Not for protection, not for a story. Because I'd rather be exposed by you every day of my life than believed in by anyone else." She looked at the ring. She looked at the man, and Nora Bennett, who had walked into the most dangerous house in New York 6 weeks ago to bury its master in newsprint, closed her hand around it and said yes. She wanted it understood, later, when people told the story wrong, that no one had rescued her. No dark prince had swept in to save the overlooked girl. She had built her own case, in her own hand, over 11 years, with a stack of medical bills climbing the wall behind her. She had walked into the fortress on purpose. She had learned the house, followed the money, wired herself against a killer, and read a traitor's death sentence aloud in her own steady voice. Damiano Vitale had not made her powerful. He had only, at long last, been the first person in her life to see the power that was already standing in front of him, and to stand beside it rather than in its way. They gave her a name in the city after that. Not the big girl on obituaries. They called her the woman who took down 2 families with a byline, and they said it the way you'd name a storm you'd be a fool to sail into, and they were right to. They spent 11 years deciding she wasn't worth watching, and by the time they finally looked up, she was already standing on everything they'd tried to take. That is the lesson the cruel ones never learn until it's far too late. The woman you overlook is the one holding the recorder, the one keeping the true account. And one day she will print your name in letters too large to bury. If a fierce, unbreakable heroine is your kind of story, do her the honor of a like, share this with someone who's been underestimated one too many times. and subscribe so you never miss the moment the overlooked one takes her crown. And tell me in the comments. The second Nora told Camilla she'd quote her for the record. Did you already know she was going to walk out of that house owning everything?